This episode was suggested by several listeners, Heather from Washington and Luke on Facebook. If you'd like to make a suggestion or ask us a question, you can contact us on Facebook /Morbid Curiosity Podcast, on Twitter @Morbid Podcast, and on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. The Morbid Curiosity Podcast continues to be sponsored by Audible.com. If you're busy like me, but you still want to read up on all sorts of morbid history or keep up with the latest science fiction and fantasy, Audible is the way to go. There are over 180,000 titles to choose from, and you can listen to these audiobooks on your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or other MP3 player while you work, cook, on your commute, or at the gym. MCP listeners can also get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial by going to www.audibletrial.com/MCP. If you sign up for the free trial, you get a free audiobook that is yours to keep, and the MCP gets the funding it needs to keep bringing morbid history to your ears. For now, on with the episode. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so the mysterious and unsolved. This interest in disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped hundreds of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. This week, the MCP is trying something different. Instead of our usual episode, I have an interview with an expert on Slenderman, Dr. Andrea Kitta of East Carolina University. Let us know if you like this episode and if you'd like to hear more like it. But for now, let's talk about Slenderman. Hello, Dr. Kitta, and welcome to the Morbid Curiosity Podcast.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
So, Dr. Kitta, let's talk about this creepy creature, Slenderman. I know his legend is more recent than many other paranormal creatures, being that his tale started on the website Creepypasta in 2009. Can you tell me what Creepypasta is all about, and how the Slenderman legend was created?
Sure, absolutely. Well, the creepypasta, the idea of creepypasta actually comes from copypasta, which comes from the idea of copying and pasting something and then kind of spreading it on in that sort of way. So at first, a lot of these stories were just sort of copied and pasted anonymously. They didn't really have an original sort of author, but then they sort of morphed into a genre where the author became more important over time. Generally speaking, creepypasta is usually short horror stories that people kind of pass around, and that was sort of the origin of it. And they've become more of a more basis in, well, I mean, there's a lot of different places actually where you can find them, but there are creepypasta websites, there's Reddit, there's a lot of other places where people continue to share these stories and comment on these stories. And in some ways, they've become a lot like fan fiction, where they're being collaboratively written with the feedback of audience. But some of them are actually ways that authors are actually getting started in places, and ways that stories are actually morphing into other forms of popular culture. Like a great example right now is Channel Zero. They are doing creepypastas. The first one they started off with was the Candle Cove creepypasta, and this season they're actually doing No End House. So they're actually kind of starting off as this sort of community collaboration that's morphing into a place for especially young authors to start out, and then that is actually being taken into, other versions of popular culture like TV shows and movies and places like that. That's where Slenderman kind of got to start in some extent. He actually got to start on the Something Awful forum. And it just started off as hey, post something creepy, like let's make something scary. And Slenderman was posted there with a couple of photoshops and some very brief descriptions, and it just really took off from there. It's actually kind of amazing how fast it took off from there. There was just something there that people really identified with in some sort of way, and something that really spoke to them, which is really fascinating. And it just continued to grow to the point where people were creating fan fiction about Slenderman, and sometimes in cases underneath other names too, because Slenderman is currently copyrighted. So I think in this case we're allowed to use it because it's considered, fair use, academic use. But it is actually a copyrighted term now, although I did just very recently read I believe it was a law journal that wrote about how it shouldn't be copyrighted. So there's, I guess, some debate on that as well. So a lot of people started using other terminology. They started using things like thin man or skinny man or fear dub, and there's a bunch of different names for him. So you'll see all these like sort of different versions of him, in some ways to get around the copyright, but also to kind of induce some creativity within the community. Because there was a point actually where Slenderman stories actually kind of got banned on some of these sites because people are saying, all right, that's enough Slenderman, like let's do something else. It's gotten that popular, and of course it became really more of a household name in the Slenderman stabbings. Of course, that trial is ongoing. The sentencing, at least, is ongoing.
Could you describe Slenderman for our listeners that haven't heard of him?
Absolutely. So Slenderman is usually shown as a tall, slender man. That's pretty much in the name. He usually has no face whatsoever or very limited features. His face is usually white, and he's usually wearing a black suit with a white shirt and a black tie. And in some cases, he has tentacles. In other cases, he does not.
You said that he started as a photoshopped image, but how did the image go from having a more fleshed out background? I've heard several different versions of it, but it's basically a huge conglomeration of many stories.
It is, yeah, and that's just it. People, when they first saw those first images, a lot of different people started writing and creating things. There's videos out there. There's a bunch of different stories that are written. It's just amazing. There's fan art like you wouldn't believe. It's absolutely amazing how much this inspired people to create things. You know, you'll find entire YouTube series based off of Slenderman or the Slenderman story. And it's amazing how much stuff there is out there. And it's gone into so many other places too, like into video games, into TV shows. It just kind of has really blossomed in this way that, you don't see happen with everything that's out there. For some reason, this really, really kind of spoke to people on some level.
You said that his legend is so popular that it's crossed media platforms from the internet to TV and has even been featured in really popular games like Minecraft. And that Slenderman has several games himself?
Yes, he does. There's Slenderman's 8 Pages. There's a couple of other ones, too. I can think of about 2 or 3, but I can't remember their exact names right now, of course. But yeah, there's multiple ones, or there's even just ones where, like in Minecraft, where he's sort of a character, except there he's Enderman. Yeah, it's spread into a lot of different forms of popular culture. There's even games where, you can play them on your phone. You don't even need to play them on a console or a computer or anything like that. There's so many versions of it now. There's so many different ways to kind of interact with this legend.
Could you describe his story? What is it that he does that makes so many people identify with him?
That's a really interesting thing. There's no real set way that he interacts, and it's really morphed over time. Some of the early ones, there was this notion that he kidnapped children or he was involved in some way with children, and that's kind of carried through. But I remember early on there was a legend that he would take out your internal organs and replace them. There's like all this stuff that's kind of fallen away. So it's interesting. I would say that now, currently, he is involved with children, although whether or not he kidnaps them or uses them as proxies or influences them in other sort of ways is currently under debate. There's also just the notion, too, that he's just watching. So he's a figure that sort of stands and physically watches you. Sometimes he doesn't really do anything in particular. He's just sort of there in a way that maybe we saw, previously with characters like Mothman.
That's creepy.
Yeah.
Considering the way the Slenderman story spread, do you think that Slenderman can be classified as a folkloric figure? And just for our audience, folklore is loosely defined as the stories a community passes down by word of mouth.
Yes, I do think we can consider him folkloric in a lot of different ways. I think that he actually attaches to something that scholars in folklore are calling the folklore-esque. So he looks like folklore without actually being folklore, and he works like folklore without actually being tied to a sort of a long-standing tradition. Although I think in some ways he is tied to some traditions, although not directly, more in a way that's a little, well, what one scholar refers to as fuzzy illusion. It's not direct, it's a little bit more amorphous than that. But he definitely spreads in a way that really shows manipulation and personalization, which is something we look for in folkloristics, to see how people actually manipulate something, even in something in popular culture, and they change it and they personalize it in different ways. And he certainly works in that way. Just based off of fan fiction and fan art alone, he's definitely moved into the folkloric realm. We see that especially with his meaning, too, he's changed so much over time, and what he does, how he looks, what his actions are, what the end result of what happens has been changed and manipulated in so many different ways that it's really responding to a sort of community aesthetic that keeps changing as well.
And is his creation similar to pre-internet folklore, or is it very different?
In a lot of ways it is very similar. I think it's sort of it's a little bit more on steroids to some extent. It's happening so much faster just because the information is getting around faster. We had, these sort of collaborative collective stories long before we had the internet. It took a little while longer because people would mail things around, or they would photocopy them around, or, something along those lines. We see the definite spread. We just kind of see it's just happening faster than we've seen it in the past. It's still all there. It just, like I said, it's kind of on steroids. It's just happening so quickly. But it's getting passed around the same kind of groups. We still have folk groups of people who are interested in similar things that are passing this on, and then they change it and they manipulate it and they do different things. Watching the costuming alone actually is pretty fascinating, because there are a lot of people who cosplay as Slenderman, which is really interesting. And you can see entire boards dedicated to, like, how do I do this better? Like, how is this? Here's how I built stilts for my Slenderman costume. So people are engaging in this way that is just fascinating, but is very similar to the way that they would have engaged in the past.
Slenderman cosplay, that is cool.
Yeah, people have done some pretty good videos, too, of it.
Definitely, that's going to be a Google hole that I dive down later.
As you should.
Even though Slenderman's fictional origins can be easily traced online, there's actually some offline belief in Slenderman that I never would have considered before reading some of your articles. Why do you think that is?
I think in part it's because when we pass on this information, we do it in a lot of different ways, right? The same as you would hear anything else. You might see something online or on a social media site, and then later on you're talking with somebody face to face and say, hey, did you see that thing on? We're kind of passing it around in a lot of different ways. It's not just entirely on the internet. And I think in some cases, especially when I talk to my students about how they found out, where did they hear it from, they frequently hear it the way that children's folklore has always been passed on. It's passed on from older kids. They hear about it from an older sibling. Somebody on the playground knows about it and tells all the other kids. So the way it's getting passed around is really interesting. It's happening off of the internet as well as on it, and in combination with it too. So you have people going back and forth between the internet and in these more of the way we think of traditional folklore is happening is on playgrounds in these like small social groups. It's really kind of cool to see that because, well, me personally as someone who did not grow up with the internet and came into it later on in life, it's so fascinating to see that there is really not the demarcation that I put between in real life and on the internet. They're kind of blended into this blurred area where real life happens on the internet. It's not that same sort of demarcation, which is actually another thing I think that Slenderman kind of speaks to is fear of the internet as well.
Actual belief in Slenderman has been associated with at least one known case in the news, and that is of the 12, I think they're 12 years old.
They were at the time.
The two girls in Waukesha, Wisconsin, who lured another girl into the woods and stabbed her 19 times in the name of Slenderman. Thankfully, the girl who was attacked survived, but what do you think drove these girls to do this, and why do you think they thought it would please Slenderman?
That's a really interesting question because I think it's a really complicated issue and a lot of people are trying to simplify it. I have a lot of sympathy for, well, not only the girl who got stabbed, but also the girls who were involved, because there was a lot going on there, I think. And I think we are never going to know the whole story. We've heard stories about mental illness. We've heard stories about bullying and a lot of other things. But I think there's a lot of factors that figured into this. I think in some ways, the girls were probably lonely. It's very, very hard to form friendships. I think a lot of people forget what it was like to be a young teenager and how awful it is most of the time and how hard it is to interact with other children. And I think people forget that they are still children. They are still involved in this as a form of what folklorists would call dark play. And we engage in a lot of forms of dark play, especially as children. We do things like play Bloody Mary or light as a feather, stiff as a board, or play with Ouija boards and all of that kind of stuff. They had cultivated this really interesting fantasy to some extent where they were engaging with this probably other members of communities online, so they didn't feel alone in that sort of way. They were talking about it to each other. And there, at some point, the line between fantasy and reality got blurred. And I don't think that's uncommon in children. I think it's pretty easy for that to happen. I think in a lot of ways we're treating this as if it's something that rarely happens when it's actually something that frequently happens. It just doesn't happen to this extent. I think kids get lost in fantasy quite easily. And I think we do as adults too. I don't think this is just something that children do. We make decisions that aren't always in our own best interest. And in this case, I think that, it was a confluence of a lot of things. It was a confluence of their age and possible, and I hate when people blame everything on mental illness. That really bothers me. First off, I think it's a very privileged standpoint. We tend to talk about people who are Caucasian as being mentally ill, and we tend not to use that term for people of color. So I think that's very problematic. Also, we know that people with mental illness are more harmful to themselves than they are to other people. I mean, there's so many studies that show that. So I hate to blame this all on mental illness. I think there's a lot of other factors involved. And I think this is something that frequently, especially young girls, get involved in. There's a really interesting article by Elizabeth Tucker, and it's a response to an article actually, and she talks about how it is a little bit of a all but for the grace of God go I kind of moment. Like, what if as a kid I had made all these statements about how much I hated school and was going to burn down the school, and then the school caught fire? And it might not have had anything to do with me, but I certainly would have been blamed in that situation, right? But this, of course, there is a very direct result. I'm not trying to belittle what they did. They stabbed another person, and that is a huge problem. But I think it's much more complicated than just saying it's just mental illness. It's just not understanding the difference between fantasy and reality. It's any one of these things. I think there's a lot of factors at play here. And I think we need to recognize that there are certain things like bullying that could have been a huge part of this. I think what we're seeing is the result of a lot of social factors, and people want an easy answer, and there isn't one. I think we need to take a long, hard look at how did this happen in the first place. And I certainly don't want to blame any one individual. I don't think it's parents' fault. I don't think it's the school's fault or any of that kind of stuff. But there's a lot going on there. There's a lot of factors, and I think we need to consider them and not go for the easy answer, which I feel like that's something that we like to do. We like to go for, they were mentally ill and that's what their problem is. No, that's not all of it. There's some other stuff going on there. And I think we do forget, especially for young women, how hard it is to grow up. That's actually been a suggestion that when I've talked about this in other places where I've done lectures and even talking about with my graduate students, some people actually think that Slenderman might be a representation of toxic masculinity. And in some ways, these girls were also figuring out things like interacting with male figures, possibly even attraction, those kind of things as well, because we actually, weirdly enough, see a lot of Slenderman, what's called slash fiction, these things that are romantic in nature or sexual in nature. It's a little odd, but there it is. And so they might have been processing some things like that as well, including what does that mean to grow up as a woman in North American culture? And that's a factor as well. We have to think about things like bullying. We have to think about things like misogyny. We have to process all of these different ways that women, especially as they're growing up, are given a lot of mixed messages about a lot of different things. So I think that's also a factor in all of this.
That is a lot of complicating factors. Do you know, trial-wise, how the results of the trial were, or is that still ongoing?
It's still ongoing, yes. As of right now, it's still ongoing. It's complicated in a lot of different ways because I know the sentencing hasn't happened yet. There are still things where people are trying to figure a lot of this out, I think, in a lot of different ways. It's some of the news reports are a little confusing. So, and that's, it's hard to kind of decipher exactly what's happened. I sadly have not had time. I know there was one site that was live streaming it, and I have not had time to sit down and watch it. So, unfortunately, I would love to have the time to do that, and I will do that at some point.
They were charged as adults, correct?
I can't remember, actually, because they were going back and forth for a long time, and I can't remember what they decided on, if it was charged as adults or as minors.
Have there been any other incidents like this one?
We've had a couple of incidents. There was an incident in Florida where I believe she almost burned the house down. And there was another incident where there was a near stabbing. So we've had some kind of copycat type activity. We haven't seen anything on the scale of the Slenderman stabbing since. Hopefully we won't. I also think, too, in a lot of ways, we got distracted by the clowns. The stories that came out about clowns standing around menacingly last year, and that was interesting, too, because the clowns kept showing up in the woods, which is where Slenderman frequently shows up. So I thought that was an interesting, change. That happened a little bit less this year, in spite of the fact that It has come out, was, been remade. And I kind of expected a little bit more on clowns this year, but apparently last year was the year of clowns, and it seemed like we kind of shifted the focus, at least in the media, from Slenderman to that. But I'm sure we'll still see, there's probably still going to be things that are going to be copycatted. And there's a lot of stuff, too, that wasn't related that was blamed on it, which was also interesting. There was a couple that had done some crimes in, I believe it was Las Vegas, and it was just sort of casually mentioned that they also cosplayed as Slenderman. And it was like, wow, those things really don't have anything to do with each other. But we were talking about so much about Slenderman that people thought, oh, well, maybe there's a connection here. But there really wasn't. So we have seen some copycatting that happened shortly after the Slenderman stabbing incident. But we haven't seen anything in recent months, at least, not that I've noticed.
I read something about several suicides that occurred at Pine Ridge Reservation.
Yes. That is really interesting, and that really came out in an article where I think this is also an unimportant thing. The article was written by someone that was not in the community, and I would be really interested, and I've done a bit of research on Pine Ridge community and their interpretation of this being Slenderman. Basically, what the original article said was that they kind of connected this suicide spirit that people were sort of associating with Pine Ridge and their very, very high suicide rate. It's actually exceedingly high, especially young teenagers. So some people were drawing this connection to the suicide spirit and making the connection to Slenderman, especially teenagers were. And there wasn't a ton of evidence about this, but there was some evidence that this could be happening. I looked into the suicide spirit, sometimes called the Tall Man. There's not a lot published about it, but I wouldn't, honestly, with it being a part of Native American culture, I wouldn't expect there to be a lot published about it. I would expect that there's very likely stories going around that I'm not privy to as someone who is not from that descendancy. That's another issue, is you have to be on the inside sometimes to get these stories. I am not on the inside of that. It is entirely possible that there is some linkage there, and there were certainly some teenagers that were online that were making that linkage, that were both from the community and outside of the community. And it was their interpretation of this older tradition of this tall man spirit, or this suicide spirit, being linked to Slenderman. And that's something we actually see in a couple of other places where people are making this linkage, whether it really exists or not, to Slenderman in a lot of different ways. And in some ways, sometimes people do that to make the tradition sound older, but also because they see the connection. They look at it and they're like, wow, this sounds just like this other thing, even though they're not technically connected. It doesn't mean that they're not speaking to something greater that maybe people understand or have processed in a different way. It's a really fascinating thing to see some of the conversations that have happened. I've looked a lot online because that's what I'm able to do. So yeah, I would love to know more. I've been looking into this for a while, and I would love to hear more about it. But I wonder, I can't help but to be a little bit suspicious that since the majority of the stuff came from one article, I always like to have multiple sources. That's just me as an academic, though.
I'm there with you. Another sort of paranormal creature that Slenderman reminded me of were men in black, because they are also faceless and wear suits. Do you know if there's any connection there?
I think that there could be in some ways, because that was immediately what I thought of too, as the Men in Black tradition, especially involved with UFOs, and after the UFO tradition as well, where someone sees some lights in the sky, these people show up at the house, there's something uncanny about them, they don't seem exactly human, or they move in a strange way, or they look a little bit strange. They take the person's sort of story, take pieces of evidence if there is any, and then promptly disappear. And then, of course, usually the stories go that an hour later, or, a significant amount of time later, the actual FBI come up, and these people of the Men in Black have pushed themselves off as some sort of authority figure, but they're actually not. They're actually also aliens or something along those lines. And I think there definitely is some kind of connection to that tradition. I think in general, this is kind of speaking to a larger issue of faceless white men in suits. You don't have to get terribly symbolic to see anything there. I think in some ways it kind of shows this fear of large agencies of government in some ways, but also of this tradition of we don't know who these people are. They come, they have these credentials that look legitimate, but are they really? Who are these people who are watching us? That kind of stuff. But I think there could be a connection there. The interesting part, though, is a lot of the people I talk to, especially when I get the chance to talk to children about it, they, of course, have their conception of Men in Black is the movies, which is totally different than the sort of long-standing or older tradition, I should say, of Men in Black. For them, it's not the same thing, but they have a connection there somehow, though. They have this connection with the faceless man in a suit is something that speaks to them on some sort of level.
They kind of did that on Doctor Who, too, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. It was in Doctor Who. There was ones in Buffy. There was also ones in the TV show Fringe. They all had men in suits. Some of them had faces, some of them did not. Some of them had like hyperly real features. Some of them were a little more blank. But yeah, they were all sort of these white guys in suits. And a lot of times they just watched. They didn't do anything specifically. They were just sort of there. It's interesting that we've seen pop culture versions of this either because of the Slenderman tradition or that kind of came around the same time or even earlier. I've even had people tell me that he looks like Jack Skellington from The Nightmare Before Christmas.
People who believe in Slenderman have theorized that he's a tulpa, a thought form, or a being that is physically created from the collective thoughts of separate individuals. This is a theoretical concept that originates in Tibetan mythology. Have you heard of this, and what's your take on it if you have?
Yes, I have heard of this. I've heard of the thought form, the tulpa, and sometimes people call it a egregore as well. The notion that you can kind of think these things into being. And when I heard that, I immediately thought of there's a very long-standing supernatural tradition of if you ignore it, it will go away kind of idea. So the notion of the more you pay attention to these things, it actually gives them power that they feed off of. Some people have thought that about Mothman as well. There is a sort of long-standing tradition of the more you concentrate on this, that you can actually create these things into being, which is a really interesting concept. That it's us that creates these things. It's not that they are outside of what is natural or created by some other being, that we create these things ourselves. And that's fascinating to me to think about it in those sort of terms. Not only is this sort of a theoretical, interesting mental exercise, but also that we can literally will something into being by thinking about it, which is just fascinating. That's a really interesting idea, too, because in some thoughts and theories, then, we have the power to control it then. We just have to decide collectively that this is how one defeats Slenderman, or this is how one is able to manage Slenderman in some sort of cases, because we don't see a lot on that, actually. There's not a whole lot out there on what to do if Slenderman is after you, if you have slender sickness, which is another thing that has arisen out of all of this. There's no cure for that. There's nothing you can do. But if we have created this entity, we've made him, then we can change and manipulate how he works. We can decide collectively how to defeat him. But we haven't done that yet, which is also very interesting. Like, why isn't there more stuff out there on how to deal with this? If it happens, a lot of it is just saying, yeah, that's too bad. That's it for you. That's it. You're either going to become someone that he controls, or you're going to go insane, or you're going to go missing or die, or something along those lines. It's sort of interesting that we haven't created an out for ourselves in this story, but we haven't. There's very few things out there that, at least that anyone has really strongly attached to, that give us a solution for Slenderman or a way of defeating Slenderman, which is really fascinating.
I'm surprised that we haven't. Usually there's always, here's the monster, here's how to kill it.
Yeah, exactly. And there's nothing there on how to kill him or how to get rid of him or any of that. That's really fascinating to me. I cannot figure out why we haven't done that. It could be still that he's in flux, because we do see, as I mentioned, some of the fan fiction actually gets into Slenderman as someone who rescues, especially in the stories that people write, that rescues young girls and women from other bullies. So he actually isn't a bad figure. He's a rescuer. He's a savior in some sort of ways, although it usually still doesn't turn out terribly well for the main character.
You mentioned slender sickness. What is that?
Slender sickness is actually, it's a condition that people have created, and there's a lot on this online. People have kind of morphed it into different things. There's actually symptoms you can find online, too, if you're really interested. You can take a quiz on if you have it, which I also find fascinating that someone created a quiz. But it's a type of illness that there are progressions to it, where at first you might do things like, you might feel confused, you lose track of time. Then it sort of morphs into, you kind of slowly go more and more insane. In some cases, there are also physical symptoms such as nosebleeds, dizziness, nausea. A lot of different things like that, which is really fascinating, because one of the things I've done recently, and this is in a book that I'm writing that is coming out hopefully sometime next year, I actually compared what the symptoms of slender sickness are to the symptoms of bullying, and they're remarkably similar.
That is interesting. I was going to say maybe even like what they used to describe as hysteria.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely some similarities there as well. And some people actually see it as a form of radiation poisoning, that Slenderman he's radioactive in some sort of way. This is actually a physical illness that is not dissimilar to radiation poisoning, which is another fascinating aspect of it.
Gosh, the more we talk about this, the more I'm just confused.
I know, right?
It's great. There's so many ways to dive in. It's just great.
It is. And I think that's one of the parts that's so cool about this, is that he is this way of interpreting the world, that you can use him in so many different ways. Like, he could mean so many different things, and it's all in looking at what group you're looking at. So if I'm looking at young women or young people who are identifying as women, I should say that because we're on the internet, you can be whoever you want to be. So these are people who are identifying as women who are writing fan fiction about Slenderman, and that's a specific group and what they say and what they feel and think. And then if we talk about what do smaller children think, and it's very much like a boogeyman type character. So it all depends on what group you're looking at and how he's interpreted. So he becomes this really interesting tool that people are using to talk about things in a lot of different ways.
Is that why you think maybe he's become such a prominent figure in our modern folklore?
I do. I think it's because he has so much meaning, and he can mean so many different things. And, and I've sort of written on how I think that in some ways he kind of ties into this collective feeling of being watched. And I still think that's partially true for some people, not for everybody. It's interesting that there's something there that just strikes us, and it's something that we can't stop thinking and talking about and writing about and creating videos about and cosplaying about. There's just something there that is really sparking something. And it's interesting, too, because I think that eventually we're going to get tired of it. I don't think it'll entirely disappear, but I think at some point it's not going to be like, oh, wow, another Slenderman story, how original. It's going to get to the point where it just becomes such a strong motif that it's become meaningless in some ways. It'll go through different levels of popularity and levels of belief. And it may, I really don't know where it's going to go next. I think we'll see some ebbs and flows in popularity, but I have a feeling this might have some things that are going to stay. There might be still 20 years from now, kids talking on a playground about Slenderman.
Would you say it brings out our morbid curiosity?
Absolutely. It definitely brings out our morbid curiosity.
I want to thank you again. This is Dr. Andrea Kitta from East Carolina University talking about Slenderman, and it has been a really interesting interview.
The book I'm working on it's The Kiss of Death, Contagion and Contamination in Folklore.
That sounds like a book I would love to read.
Hopefully next year it'll be out.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
The Morbid Curiosity podcast was produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic for me to talk about, you can tweet the show @MorbidPodcast or find us on Facebook and Instagram @Morbid Curiosity Podcast. If you like the show, please share us on social media and give us a rating on iTunes. Your shares and ratings help us grow. Another huge thank you to Dr. Andrea Kitta for discussing her specialty, Slenderman, with us. Let us know if you like this episode and if you'd like to hear more like it. Thanks to you, listeners, and many others, our creepy community is growing. Speaking of our creepy community, the MCP is part of the Belfry Podcast Network. Check out the other shows on the Belfry Network at www.thebelfry.rip. If you'd like to support the MCP, you can go to our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. There you'll find a donation button, links to all our social media, and other ways to contact us. The MCP is in need of funding, and your donations help us keep the podcast going. Getting a 30-day free trial from Audible also helps us, and you get a free audiobook. So please help us out by going to www.audibletrial.com/MCP or www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. We really appreciate your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.
It's really messed up stuff. I live in a dark, dark world.
Oh, you have friends here. Don't worry.